There is an anonymous piece that views the family as a garden. In an effort to understand how to best put their family together and things that are important and things we should look at, this anonymous piece tells us what we should do, what we should cultivate, and how we should help build our families well. And it is worth starting here because, once again, we're talking about a very dysfunctional family. Joseph's family is dysfunctional. Jacob has brought dysfunction into this family, and it is only getting worse. It is not getting better. We can even go back to Abraham and see some of the dysfunction begin. And so as we think about this idea, this anonymous piece tells us that a family, like many things, is perhaps most like a garden. There are things that need to be cultivated. There's things that need time and attention. There's things that need sunshine of laughter and affirmation. But families also need difficulties. Families need tense moments. Families have serious discussions about issues that matter. And there must be spade work where harness is broken, loose and planted, fresh seed to accomplish what needs to be done. With lots of TLC, a family can be cultivated. And so in this suggestion from this author, they tell us there's a few things worth planning. The first is this: 4 rows of peas. Preparedness, perseverance, promptness, politeness. Then 3 rows of squash. Squash gossip, squash criticism, squash indifference. Along with 5 rows of lettuce. Let us be faithful. Let us be unselfish. Let us be loyal. Let us love one another. Let us be truthful. And then 3 rows of turnips. Turn up with a smile. Turn up with a new idea. Turn up with determination. They conclude this by saying, and then? Well, then on it's pretty simple. Water, weed, tend with care, and patiently watch the garden grow. Someday you'll look back and realize it was worth all the years of all the work and effort and prayer. Like a lovely garden, your family will be a thing of grateful praise, of seasonal beauty, and of daily sustenance. Taking time to cultivate our families, taking time to work on these relationships as parents and as individuals is always worthwhile. And it is something that would have made these stories drastically different had Jacob and his family had done it. Had they put the time and the effort into cultivating a healthy family. And we see here a lot of issues that arise. And when we don't take time to make sure our families are healthy, we can become aloof to what is happening. We can become disinterested in our family. Or we can simply begin to push the problems away, hoping that they go away. But this is always going to come back to haunt us. These things don't just go away, they come back, and they usually come back with a vengeance. So let's dive into the last patriarch of Genesis. The Joseph narrative will finish out the book. He goes all the way through chapter 50. And we've now begun the last one. Now you'll continue to see Jacob and his family and his sons, but Joseph is now the focus from here on. This is where the direction has gone. And this will take us all the way to the end of Genesis. And so we get here to Genesis 37, 1 through 4. We see something very important. Joseph is loved more than his brothers. In verse 1, we see Jacob now lives in the same land as his fathers. He lives where Abraham and Isaac wandered and began to settle. The first verse informs us that Israel has finally made it home. Israel and Jacob and his family have finally settled in Canaan, the land that they have been promised, but have struggled so hard to remain in. And we see that now they are finally here. A journey that began in Genesis 32 is finally concluded in Genesis 37. Israel is finally home. But even this homestay will be short-lived. They don't stay here very long. If you go down to verse 2, you'll see that Joseph is a shepherd. He's 17. And this would have been expected of him. Young boys, teenagers were shepherds. That's what they did. They would help watch the goats and the sheep and the herds. But with that, Joseph seems to be at a little higher place than his brothers. He is kind of watching over his brothers. He is the one who is in charge of making sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Because he is the son of the beloved wife. He is the son of the late Rachel, who has passed away. And so he has oversight over his brothers, at the very least over his brothers who were through Jacob's concubines. And so he comes to report what they are doing. As you can imagine, if you have siblings, when your sibling comes to tell your father or your mother what you're doing wrong, that doesn't typically make you very happy. And so this is definitely the case here. Joseph's brothers, are not really a big fan of him. And so we see what has kind of been understood up to this point is now made explicitly clear in verses 3 through 4 when Genesis tells us this. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. One of the many ways that Jacob shows his love for Joseph is by giving him an elaborate coat. This coat would have been sewn together of different colors, of different colored fabrics. And there's some debate as to what exactly the coat looked like. The coat could have either been a long-sleeved robe that came down to his knees. It could have been a long-sleeved coat, more of a coat form. Or it could have been a sleeveless robe that went all the way down to his knees. There's only one other time that this word here for robe is mentioned. It's in 2 Samuel 13:19 when it describes Tamar's robe. And so we're not really sure what it looked like, but we do know a few things. First thing is we know that it was very colorful. It was a very nice cloak, robe, whatever exactly it was. And it was something that showed his importance and his love in the family. Jacob gives him this brightly colored coat. And so this was something that was done. You would dress your children in bright colors, these children that you loved in bright colors. This is something that is still done today in these cultures. These kids would be dressed in really bright colors, and I think it's something we even do today. We dress our kids in these bright, flashy colors. And so Jacob is showing his love for his son by dressing him in this coat. And something I always find interesting when we think about these Old Testament Bible stories, it's sometimes easy to think of them in black and white, as if everything's drab and everything's gray and everything's white. But the reality is these cultures were very, very colorful. There was a lot of color to be found in all of these. So when you read these stories and they describe clothes or tents or things, you should view those as colorful, because a lot of times they were. And so here Jacob is given this colorful coat. And so now he has a physical representation of his dad's favor towards him. An outward look, we can see how much dad loves Joseph, because look at the coat he has just given him. So along with the favor that dad has now just bestowed on Joseph, there's something else worth noting, is that this probably put Joseph in a position of leadership. Brightly colored coats and robes is not what you work in. In the same way, you don't go tend your garden in your yard in your suit and tie. He's now wearing a coat that he's not going to get dirty in. He's not watching the sheep in this coat. He's not tracking goats through mountains in this coat. He's now been put in a position almost of leadership. And so he has favor as well now as leadership. And so he has love and stature in the family are both confirmed by Jacob's actions. He gives him this coat. But there's something worth noting here right off the bat in our first application. Showing favoritism towards our kids leads to strife, pain, and broken relationships. When we favor one child over the other, this only leads to hurt and pain and suffering. We can also mention our new application that we have said many weeks in here, right? More is caught than taught. Isaac and Rachel both showed favoritism towards their sons, Esau and Jacob respectively. And Jacob followed suit. He learned. We show favoritism. The son I love the most is the son who I give stuff to. And so he has learned this. And so Jacob's favoritism extends beyond his children, however. If you remember, he loved Rachel more than he loved Leah. Jacob has created a very unhealthy and a very toxic environment within his own home. Whether he knows it or not, we're not sure. But he has created an unbelievably toxic situation within his own home. And he continues to make it worse. Whether Jacob pushes the toxicity away or is just aloof to it all going on, we don't know. But he gives his son a coat that continues to affirm his status. And so what we see is favoritism is something most parents face and should be wary of. One study revealed this: 65% of families reported evidence of favoritism. This extends beyond just a few families. and has been revealed to be evident across cultures and across every marker imaginable. 65%. It is a major factor in childhood development and leads to issues later in life. It has been labeled parental differential treatment, or PDT for short. And so what we see is, although favoritism is really an issue between the parents and the children, it has a huge effect on how children relate to each other. Favoritism can harm the sibling bond over the life course and increase tensions and conflict between siblings. This is especially worrying, as having a good relationship with our sibling is important for our lifelong health and happiness. We see that psychology issues are centered around children with PPD or PDT. The children struggle with their relationships with each other. Not only do we have issues between parents and children, but now we have issues between children. And the sentiment is echoed by Mallory Williams as she looks at the long-term effects on kids. The biggest long-term dangers are depression, anxiety, unstable or even traumatic reactions in personal relationships, and performance anxiety for both the favored and the non-favored children. When favoritism takes a prominent place in our family, some long-term effects and issues are going to appear. We can unintentionally hurt our family, our kids, and make life harder on those around us when we show favoritism on one kid over another. This is seen in Jacob's life and his kids. These actions greatly affect the kids who are not considered the favorite. But it also has a negative effect on the child who is the favorite. The article continues, while being the favored child may sound like a walk in the park, it's far from it. Being favored means almost always being resented by the other children. The parents' unequal attention poisons sibling relationships without even trying. These quotes and ideas are seen in Joseph's life and his interaction with his brothers. Now, they are extreme, for sure, but Jacob has created an extreme environment of this favoritism towards Joseph. Showing favoritism to one child over another has long-term effects on the family and can greatly hurt the relationships between our children and between our spouse and between those around us. And as we look at this chapter, and as you look at the rest of this chapter, you will see these things appear. Although, like I said, are they extreme? Absolutely. But are they showing exactly what modern psychology is telling us the problem is? Absolutely. They have a problem. There is no interchild relationship. There is no interpersonal relationship. And what we see very plainly and evidently in chapter 37 is they hate Joseph. Genesis very seldom talks in the sensory language. It tells you what's going on and moves on. It doesn't tell you how they feel or what they're thinking, but we're going to see plainly that they hate Joseph and what is going on. And it's important to remember this and to look at these things, because sometimes we read these stories as if they're devoid of real life. As if they're devoid of what could really happen in the real psychological and pain implications of the decisions that are being made. Jacob has created a toxic environment in his own home that is going to lead to what happens next because of his overabundance of favoritism towards one child over the other. And it's not hard to see their issues. If you remember from Genesis 33, Jacob lines his children up basically from least loved to most loved. He thinks Esau is going to kill him and his family, and so he puts Joseph at the end of the line. And you know that his other children saw this and understood this. And like I said, verse 8 tells us that they hate him. And we see how much Joseph is loved. And they are all aware Joseph is more loved than they are. And so we continue on. Verse 4 tells us these ideas are seen plainly in verse 4. They state their frustration and point out how they hate their brother. They hate Joseph so much they can't even talk to him. They can't say anything nice. There's nothing pleasant they can mention or say to him. They hate him. And this problem in their relationship. This creates the first tension within the story. The author here is setting up these tensions now within the story, and he creates the first one here. Joseph's brothers hate him. And so, it would not be hard to see how we go from this description in verse 4, in these first beginning verses, to his brothers trying to kill him, to his brothers throwing him into slavery. This is actually the expected outcome. This is what you would expect would happen. And so he creates the first tension. Now we wonder what's going to happen next. How is Joseph going to survive this? Is Joseph really the main character throughout the rest of this story? How can he be? But I think of this application here. It's not over until it's over. I don't want to be trite here. I don't want to take something that may be difficult and turn it into a little pithy phrase. But it is worth remembering. The author is continually building this tension and drawing our attention back to this reality. Joseph here is surrounded by enemies. And this time, instead of it being people from outside around them, Joseph is surrounded by his own family who hates him. The author continually builds this tension, and we can often miss this tension because we know these stories. You know what happens next in the life of Joseph. You know where this goes from here. Yeah, his brothers hate him, but look what ends up happening at the end. The author is intentionally building tension within the story so that you are forced to wrestle with, how is this actually going to work out? What is going to happen here? Joseph's brothers hate him. And Jacob has already created an environment that is toxic and does not create real or healthy relationships for his children. He doesn't help the situation at all by noticing the situation, but he continues to rain down praise and accolades on his son. And at this point, if you're reading this for the first time, you would wonder, how on earth is this going to work out? Which should bring us back to our point. It's not over till it's over. The author has put us in a really difficult spot. And I don't feel like it's too far of a stretch to draw our attention back to this. If the story stopped here, and if I were to tell you by the end of Genesis 37, they sell him into slavery, they try to kill him and sell him into slavery, you would say, yeah, I get that. I see why they did that, or how we got to that point. But we know that's not how the story ends. That's not what happens. But how often do we deal with this in our own lives? This tension of not knowing what's coming next, this tension of maybe being surrounded by enemies, surrounded by people who don't want what's best for us. We live in constant tension of not knowing the future and wondering what's coming next. Like I said, the problem is we miss that in these stories because we already know the story. There is major tension here. What is going to happen next? And in our own lives, we wonder how many times, how could God possibly work out this situation in my life to any sort of good or any sort of or conclusion? Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt like that? Wondering what's going to happen next? How can God possibly work this out? Have you ever wondered where God is and how this could possibly work out? And I think we should remember Paul's words in Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for the good, for those who are called according to His purpose. Does that mean everything is going to work out the way we want it to? No. There will still be difficulty. There's still going to be challenges. But it does mean God is working. It does mean God is moving. And this could be the theme verse for Joseph's life. God is always working everything out for the good of those who are called according to His purpose. While God is in it, it is not done till it's done. And as we look at the rest of this narrative, or as you think about the rest of the story of Joseph, I would encourage you to try to see this for the first time. Try to read this story for the first time. Try to study it for the first time. He feels the pain of being kidnapped by his brothers. He's eventually sold into slavery and thrown into prison. And Joseph's life is falling apart for over a decade. And you have to imagine in that, at some points he began to wonder if God's promises were really going to come true. That the promise he has given here in the next few verses of this chapter were actually going to happen. I couldn't imagine sitting in prison after I'd been sold by my siblings thinking, you know what, they're all going to bow to me one day. No idea how that's going to work out. But I think of the context of Romans 8 is looking at the gospel and the future glory. This life is hard and full of trouble. It's difficult. The Bible never says otherwise. But Paul here is looking ahead towards a future glory. He says all things work out for the good of those who love God. And this idea that one day we will be called into relationship with him. For Joseph is living in difficulty for over a decade, wondering what's going to happen next. He's living in a land that's away from home and constantly wants to come back home. And I think about us, we are living in a land that is not our home. But the Bible tells us as we sojourn in a country that is not ours, we'll eventually get to go home. We get to spend eternity with God and finally be home. All things work out for the good of those who are called according to his purpose. And Joseph is hated and miserable, but eventually, we'll see, even after his death, he gets to go home. And that's what Paul is talking about here. If we believe and put our trust in God, we will eventually get to go home. Everything works out together for the good of those who are called according to his purpose. For Joseph, it's not over till it's over. The first 4 verses of Joseph's narrative in the book of Genesis tell us that he is hated by his brothers. And by the end of this chapter, he will be sold into slavery. It's not over till it's over. So we continue on and we see that Joseph is hated by his brothers. He is miserable, or not miserable per se yet, but he is hated by his brothers. And now we get to verse 5 through 11. Joseph has and shares his dreams of his brothers bowing to him. Joseph does not help the situation out at all. Whether he is just aloof to what is going on or a little prideful, we are not sure. However, there's an Old Testament teacher, maybe scholar, by the name of Chad Bird, and he asked the question, have we put a little too much on Joseph? Have we put Joseph's character a little too high? We see here that Joseph does some things that seem to put the spotlight on him. We see the beginning here. He seems to like telling on his brothers, as any brother does, younger brother especially. But he likes telling on his brothers. Now he has a dream of his brothers bowing down to him. He knows, I'm sure he knows they hate him. They can't even talk to him. They can't even look at him. But now guess what he decides to do? He's going to tell them all about his dream. This seems to be to his own self-interest and spotlight. He is hated by his brothers, and he tells them anyway. There's no tact here, and there's really no humility in Joseph's actions. Joseph has 2 dreams that say very similar things. And it's interesting, dreams were a very common thing in this day and time. People believed dreams were derived from the divine realm, and they would often take them seriously. Even common people believed that they would have dreams that would tell them about future omens or things that were going to happen. John Walton points out that people believed that the information they received in dreams could be reversed. Just because you saw it in a dream doesn't automatically mean it's going to happen. And this may indicate why his brothers do what they do. This is important as we see the actions that come later, that they believe dreams could be reversed. Dreams, like Joseph's dream of a rise to power and authority and becoming in a position higher than the rest, was not something unheard of in the day and time that he was doing this. There's an extremely famous example of Sargon, king of Akkad. While still a cupbearer to the king, he has a dream that has been recorded and chiseled down somewhere that says this: there was a single young woman. She was high as the heavens. She was broad as the earth. She was firmly set out a base of a wall. For me, she drowned you in a great river of blood. And so the eventual king Sargon of Akkad has this dream about what is going to happen to him as he is the cupbearer. But the king, Yerzabah, his advisors tell him that the dream could be interpreted to mean that Sargon was going to be the one who died. Which is interesting. They tried to deter this and they tried to kind of talk it away, even a plain dream like this. But despite the interpreter's attempts to dissuade their king that this was going to happen, Sargon did become king and would rule Akkad from 234 to 2279 BC, about 1,000 years before the life of Joseph. And so these dreams, and this idea of rising to power, and these dreams about these rise to powers were not uncommon. This was not something that would have been unheard of. This is why his brothers take this so seriously. This was not new. So let's look at Joseph's dream here in verse 7. Behold, We were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brother said to him, Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. Joseph describes the first dream. We see the sheaves of wheat. And they were binding these sheaves of wheat up, and the rest of the sheaves of wheat bowed down to Joseph's. And they understand. And it's interesting, if you know the ending of the story, Joseph really comes into power, rises to power due to a famine and storing wheat. And so this image here is not arbitrary. This image here is something that they would look ahead towards and that would eventually put Joseph into power. But there's no interpreter needed. His brothers understand what's going on. They are very frustrated and they become angry at this. They understand what Joseph is saying. He is telling them, you will bow down to me. And they call him out on what he is saying, and their anger and frustration and malice and hate towards Joseph only grows. And they can't say anything nice. This dream is focused on his brothers. You will bow down to me. But we'll see that the next dream goes beyond Joseph's brothers. In verses 9 and 10, we see that Joseph's second dream looks more to his whole family. It's also interesting to note that telling them the first dream went so well that he decides to go ahead and tell them the second dream. Once again, Joseph seems to have a little bit of interest here in being in the middle of the spotlight. I know no younger siblings have ever thought that or needed that in their lives. But here we see in verse 9, then he dreamed another dream, and he told his brothers and said, Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come and bow ourselves to the ground before you? And so we see that the second dream is a little bit different. In this one, his father and mother are included. Now, his mother being included is a little odd. If you remember a couple of chapters back, his mother, Rachel, has already died. And so the inclusion of his mother is a very strange thing in this dream. And so there's really two opinions as to why that might be the case. The first one may be that Joseph was about 10 years old when his mother died, give or take some. And more than likely, after she passed away, Bilhah, his mother's servant, probably took him under her wing, and she raised him as his mother. And so some say, well, he could just be referring to Bilhah. That's kind of it. He's just referring to the woman who more or less raised him. The second is this, and probably more in line with the biblical narrative, is that Joseph's dream is putting him in a position as now kind of the new patriarch of the family. He is greater than his parents. He is greater than his grandparents. He is greater than his mother, who even has passed away, and that he will rise to this position of spiritual patriarch position. If that is the case, then it makes sense to include dead relatives. Hey, living in the dead, I am greater than all of them. I'm taking a greater role. And that would include the inclusion of the dead relatives. I tend to lead towards the second opinion. However, the first one is still very valid. He probably was raised by Bilhah and considered her to be his mother. And we see here that also that his father Jacob, Israel, is having an issue with this. He didn't have an issue with the first dream because he probably viewed Joseph as being the son of promise. He probably viewed Joseph as being his son who he would give his patriarchalness, whatever, to. I can't think of the word off the top of my head now. But he'd give him the blessing, the birthright of the father, and he will be the patriarch. And so he doesn't have an issue with the other boys bowing down to him. Yeah, Joseph's my best son. But now he has a frustration. Hey, wait a second. I'm going to bow down to you? I don't think so. But we see that's what eventually happens. But this brings us to the second tension in the story. Once again, if you're reading the story for the first time, as if you've never seen it before, we have been put in an extremely odd position. Joseph, in the first few verses, we find out is hated by his brothers. They hate him. They can't say anything nice to him. They want nothing to do with him. And this position is only going to get worse as we go, as we see what happens next. But now the second tension in the story has been made. He has a promise. He has the promise of taking this head patriarchal position in his family and being bowed down to and being loved. But how can this be? And so now we live in this tension, and this tension only grows greater in the next few verses. How can God bring about what He has promised to this young man who is hated? They want him dead. They don't want anything to do with him. And so the author now has brought us to the second tension in the story, and that tension being, how is God going to fulfill what He has promised He is going to fulfill? And so if you're reading this for the first time, and like I said, I would encourage you to try to do that with as much as you can muster. You'll have to live in that tension until next week. But I think of in our own lives, we live in this tension all the time. We live in this tension of not knowing what is coming next. We don't know what is coming next. We're forced to wait. We're forced to wonder. We're forced to look ahead. We're forced to not know how God is going to pull this out. Things can feel like they are falling apart and we're not sure what we should do. But we have to remember that God works out all things for the good of those who are called according to His purpose and those who love Him. We also have another promise in Proverbs 3:6 that He will make our path straight if we acknowledge Him. Once again, if we acknowledge Him. It doesn't mean it's always going to work out the way we want. It doesn't mean life is always going to work out easy. But it does mean we'll be in God's will. And so as the band comes up this morning, as we finish out, as we live our lives in this tension, we need to make it our goal to create healthy and sustain healthy families. This is for the sake of our children. This is for the sake of those around us. It's for the sake of our grandchildren. It's for the sake of our families. We need to work and cultivate and dig and fight for healthy families. However, even when things are falling apart, God is still in control. Even in the tension of not knowing what is coming next or what is going to happen next, God is still in control. It's not over till it's over. Even if we mess up with how we raise our families and we don't always get it perfect, God is still in control, and it's not over till it's over. If you want to take a minute and talk with me this morning about the God who works all things out for the good of those who are called according to His purpose and love God, I would love to talk with you this morning. But let's go ahead and pray. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank You for who You are. Father, we thank You that You love us, that You're a God who's working all things out according to Your purpose for those who love You. Lord, I thank You for the promises that if we acknowledge You, You will help make our path straight. I pray that You be with us this week, Lord. I pray that You help us remember that as we live in the tension of not knowing what is coming next. How can You possibly work all this out? Father, I pray that You will help us remember that. Lord, and I pray that You just help us see the warning that is Jacob's life and Joseph's life. Father, that we need to work, to cultivate, and to grow, to produce healthy families as much as it depends on us. And all these things,